This isn't the story you were taught. This is what they never wanted you to see. The victors' brutal rituals, the women who took vengeance into their own hands, and the lone survivor, not a man, but a horse, who witnessed it all. Custer is dead, but the story doesn't end where his body fell. No, what followed was more horrifying, more human, and more buried than anyone dared to admit. This isn't just about defeat. It's about what happens when vengeance knows no bounds. Some details were so shocking they had to be concealed from the American public. Bodies desecrated, men mutilated beyond recognition, and Custer himself so savagely brutalized that the Army lied to his widow. This is the hidden truth of what happened after Custer's last stand. For the victorious Lakota and Cheyenne, it was only natural to begin by looting their fallen enemies. The American soldiers carried valuables that now rightfully belonged to the victors, just as the soldiers would have done had the battle gone the other way. Weapons, jewelry, uniforms, badges, even abandoned horses were now theirs for the taking. Lakota warrior Brave Bear was there. There was lots of fussing and quarreling over the horses and guns that were captured, he recalled. Indians were saying to each other, "I got some tobacco, I got coffee, I got a good gun." For the warriors, the spoils were their rightful reward. But the looting was far from gentle. Nearly all the dead were stripped naked and left to rot under the sun. Feet were severed to steal boots more easily. The Lakota and Cheyenne traditionally took scalps from defeated foes, and this battle was no exception. For hours afterward, the hills were a gruesome spectacle of warriors carving scalps from corpses as trophies. It wasn't just the men, either. Native accounts vividly describe how the women of the camp joined in, defiling the bodies. 2 Cheyenne women later claimed to have driven awls into Custer's ears. Years later, it emerged that someone had forced an arrow into an unmentionable part of Custer's body, a detail the Army suppressed to spare his widow. According to Lakota warrior Ironhawk, some of Custer's men pretended to be dead to escape the warriors, only to be discovered by these women. He recalled seeing 2 elderly women strip a body and begin dismembering him until the soldier suddenly sprang up, fighting back. The soldier was swiftly killed, but Ironhawk found the sight of a naked man struggling against 2 old women darkly amusing. One who reportedly wasn't amused was Sitting Bull. His visions had prophesied a great victory, but warned that disturbing the dead would bring a curse upon his warriors. Whether Sitting Bull truly opposed the mutilation remains uncertain. Since interviews with him occurred years after his defeat, he may have simply been distancing himself from acts the public deemed barbaric. But the battle didn't end with Custer's death. Most of the 7th Cavalry still survived under Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, who had fortified themselves at Reno Hill. Sitting Bull's warriors assaulted them through the night of the 25th and all through the 26th. They only withdrew on the morning of the 27th when scouts spotted approaching American reinforcements. Benteen and Reno had been too consumed by their own desperate fight to learn Custer's fate. Instead, it was General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon's reinforcements who first grasped the magnitude of the disaster at Little Bighorn. Gibbon's scouts initially discovered bloodied uniforms of American officers in abandoned camps near the battlefield, looted from the dead but discarded when Sitting Bull retreated. Before Gibbon and Terry could process this grim find, a second scout arrived with worse news. "I have counted 197 dead bodies lying in the hills." "White men?" was the first question. "Yes, white men," the scout confirmed. Terry and Gibbon now knew something had gone horribly wrong. Though they feared the entire 7th Cavalry had been annihilated, scouts soon located Benteen and Reno's survivors on the nearby hills. Terry and Gibbon hurried to meet them, finding the men battered but alive. Both officers had assumed Custer abandoned them to chase glory until they were corrected. Benteen and a detachment were immediately sent to find Custer. What they uncovered was catastrophic. The naked corpses of their comrades had already begun rotting under 2 days of Montana's scorching sun. The first bodies they found were from L Company, led by Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun. They still lay in the defensive formation they'd held in their final moments atop Calhoun Hill. Most other bodies showed no such order. Whether they'd died in chaos or had been rearranged by the victors was unclear. Another cluster of bodies lay on what would be called Last Stand Hill. Private Jacob Adams was the first to spot the 7th's commander. He summoned Captain Benteen, who rushed over to verify. "By God," Benteen said, "that's him." George Custer's body lay near the hill's summit, 20 feet from his brother Tom. Like the rest, he'd been stripped bare, save for his socks. General Custer had not been scalped, though his brother Tom had. His body was found propped upright against 2 other soldiers, as if resting. His face bore the serene expression of a man who had simply fallen asleep. Lieutenant James Bradley later wrote that the other 200 bodies from Custer's command were scattered between the hills and the river, near Sitting Bull's abandoned camp. In a letter to a newspaper, Bradley claimed the fallen had not been badly mistreated. There was little mutilation, he assured the public, insisting the wounds he saw were merely from finishing off the wounded, nothing more. But this was a lie. Private Charles Wendolf, part of the detachment escorting Benteen to the battlefield, later admitted, "That was kind of him to spare the relatives' feelings, but they were badly mutilated, some too horribly to describe." Most corpses bore grotesque injuries. Isaiah Dorman, a Black Scout, had been viciously disfigured, with a kettle of his own blood left beside him as a taunt. Nearly all the bodies had been scalped. Many were pierced with arrows or bludgeoned with axes and hammers after death. The battlefield was a gallery of cruelty. Even Custer hadn't escaped entirely. Officially, soldiers documented only his visible wounds: a bullet below the heart, another in his left temple, either fatal, and a knife gash in his thigh. They concealed the arrow forced into his groin, a detail withheld for years to spare his widow. Tom Custer's fate was worse: scalped, skull-crushed, and disemboweled. Only a tattoo on his arm made identification possible. By the time the bodies were found, 2 days under Montana's summer sun had accelerated decomposition. Colonel Gibbon noted the remains had already become offensive. The stench and horror of the scene left enduring scars on those who witnessed it. Most assume everyone on Custer's Hill was dead when Benteen arrived, but that wasn't entirely true. Private Jacob Adams, who first spotted Custer, made another chilling discovery. As soldiers picked through the carnage, a faint sound emerged from the corpses. A lone survivor cried out, "Comanche!" a 14-year-old bay horse, wounded but alive beside his dead rider. Comanche had suffered 7 bullet and arrow wounds and gone days without water, yet remained loyally by his dead master's side. Adams and the soldiers quickly came to his aid. No cavalryman could ignore such devotion in a horse. Though severely injured, Comanche managed to stand and rejoin the 7th Cavalry. Other surviving horses were also recovered from the area, but Comanche's wounds and solitary vigil on Last Stand Hill made him special. He eventually recovered and lived out a long retirement as the regiment's mascot until his death in 1891, becoming one of only 4 horses ever to receive a full military funeral. June 27th was devoted to the grim task of counting and identifying the dead. Many bodies proved unrecognizable, and even identified remains weren't always certain. 19 men from the battle were never found at all. Over subsequent decades, human remains continued to surface in the surrounding hills, suggesting some soldiers may have initially escaped the massacre only to be hunted down later. On June 28th, burial details began their work. Benteen counted 208 bodies to bury, while Lieutenant Bradley recorded 206. The exact number remains uncertain. Fear of returning Lakota warriors forced hasty burials. Most were interred in shallow mass graves where they fell, some marked with names. The Custer brothers were buried together at the hill's base in a mere 2-foot-deep grave, wrapped in canvas and covered with stones to deter scavengers. Multiple soldiers later claimed the honor of having buried Custer himself. By 6:30 p.m., the gruesome task was complete. General Terry urgently departed that evening. 50 wounded men needed proper care, and news of the disaster had to reach headquarters. The agonizing march to the Bighorn River and the waiting steamer Far West began. En route, surgeons performed emergency operations, including at least one leg amputation, though several men succumbed to their injuries before reaching proper medical care. The battle's aftermath devastated the survivors. Major Reno sought solace in alcohol, consuming 11 gallons of whiskey in the 22 days following their return from Little Bighorn. Captain Benteen similarly turned to drink. Their anguish erupted into a drunken altercation when Captain Thomas Weir accused Benteen of abandoning Custer during the fight. Benteen, refusing to tolerate the accusation, challenged Weir to a duel, an offer Weir declined. The weight of Little Bighorn proved too much for Weir, who was found dead in his New York hotel room that December. Meanwhile, the steamer Far West raced up the Missouri River, carrying both the dreadful news and 38 wounded soldiers. It broke all speed records, completing the 710-mile journey to Fort Abraham Lincoln in under 3 days. The ship's arrival before dawn on July 6th woke Libby Custer. By 7 o'clock, a delegation of officers stood at her door, insisting on speaking privately. Her sister-in-law Maggie joined them, desperate for news about her brothers and husband, Lieutenant James Calhoun, who had served alongside Custer. The officers led the women to the parlor and delivered their crushing message. Libby and George had been sweethearts since their teens and married for 12 years. Their surviving love letters reveal profound devotion. Lieutenant Gurley later recalled this as the most difficult duty of his career. Imagine the grief of those stricken women, their sobs, their flood of tears that knew no consolation. Yet Libby composed herself and insisted on accompanying the officers to inform the fort's 26 other newly widowed women. For the remainder of her life, Libby Custer dedicated herself to defending her husband's legacy, blaming Reno and Benteen for the disaster until her death in 1933. News reached Washington by telegraph the following day, shocking a nation still celebrating America's recent centennial. Newspapers obsessed over the defeat for weeks, with speculation raging about responsibility. Custer's recklessness, Benteen's actions, Reno's failures. The country mourned what would stand as one of its most devastating military losses against Native American forces. What do you believe really happened after Custer fell? Drop your theory below, because this story isn't over.